delegates, and welcome to this session of UN Women. Today, we will be discussing the topic of domestic abuse over lockdown. If you would like to speak on today's session, please use the hand raising function on Zoom or raise your hand while you're on video so I can acknowledge you, and then it will be your turn to speak. That being said, let us begin. At this point of time, delegates, are there any points or motions on the floor? Delegate of France.
Motion to open debate.
That is in order. Are there any votes for this motion? Seeing that the votes are unanimous, this motion has now passed. We are in session. Are there any points or motions on the floor at this point? Delegate of Ghana.
Point of parliamentary inquiry. How does one use the hand-raising function on Zoom?
That is a very good question, Delegate. At the bottom taskbar on Zoom, you'll see there's an icon for participants. Once you select that, there is an option to raise your hand, and it will appear on the top left corner of your screen. I hope that answers your question. That being said, are there any other points or motions on the floor? Delegate of USA.
The delegate would like to raise the motion to open the general speakers list.
That is in order. Are there any votes for this motion? Seeing that the votes are unanimous, we are now in the general speakers list. Delegates wishing to have their names added to this list, please raise your hands. Delegate of USA, followed by the delegate of France, you have been acknowledged. Delegate of USA, you have 1 minute to speak, and you may begin.
Thank you very much, Chair. The delegate of the United States of America is quite glad that this committee has come forward to address this very important topic of domestic violence and its rise during the coronavirus lockdown. It is very important to keep in mind that we have to work from home, but more importantly, it's always the abusers, domestic abusers, that work from home. Therefore, in the time of lockdown, in the time of curfew, when people can't really get out of their house, it is at this point of time where domestic violence rates have increased so much all over the world. It is a global problem and not just pertaining to one country or one culture. Therefore, the delegate of the United States believes that we can come together, create uniform solutions that will help us in addressing the roots of this problem, or just even creating the safe haven and escape routes for the women and other people who are victims to the domestic abuse. The delegate would hope that all of us would together reach a consensus on a couple of solutions that we hope would be very helpful and effective in this pandemic and lockdown and even further after. Thank you. The delegate would like to yield their time to questions.
Thank you, Delegate. You have 10 seconds left for questions. Is there anyone in the committee that has a question for the Delegate of USA? Delegate of Ghana?
Given the USA's somewhat sketchy record with the domestic abuse, how will the USA guarantee that they are the authority to implement these said changes?
Thank you, Delegate of Ghana, for your very good question. However, just to clarify, the United States had never said that they have the authority to lead the countries into the solution for domestic violence. They just hope that countries on their own accord can come together out of consideration for their citizens to create solutions for domestic violence. The USA is not a perfect country. However, we do strive to make it better and hospitable for our citizens and for citizens of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Before we move on to the general speaker's speech by the Delegate of France, are there any other delegates wishing to have their names added to the general speakers list? Seeing that once the general speakers list ends, the committee comes to an end, I would urge any other delegates to add their names. They might be called upon at any point in time in the course of today's session. So are there any delegates wishing to be added? Delegate of Ghana, thank you. You have been acknowledged. Delegate of France, your 1 minute now begins.
Thank you. Honourable Chair, fellow delegates, I will keep this brief as my honourable compatriot, the Delegate of the USA, has so rightly pointed out. This session should be mainly focused on coming to a consensus on what has been seen as a shadow pandemic that has infiltrated and perpetrated the lives of so many of the civilians in France, the USA, and further beyond. Indeed, some statistics recently published by WHO and other elements of the UN have pointed to some startling conclusions on the perpetration of domestic violence over lockdown. Conclusions that I am afraid I have to share. To put it in brief, this is a pandemic just as deadly and just as worrying as the one that has for so long completely shattered many of the lives of the civilians under our care. It is equally, domestic violence is just as ruthless at shattering the lives of the civilians under our care, and we should be just as ruthless in stamping it out. I thank you. I yield my time to the chair.
Thank you, Delegate. That being said, are there any points or motions on the floor? Delegates, are there any points or motions on the floor at this point in time? The chair would look favorably on a motion for a moderated caucus, perhaps? Delegate of France, you've been acknowledged.
Motion for a moderated caucus, topic increasing awareness on domestic violence. Overall time 2 minutes, speaker time 1 minute.
Thank you, Delegate. That is in order. Seeing that there are no other motions on the floor, we'll now move into voting on the motion for a moderated caucus on the topic of increasing awareness on domestic violence proposed by the Delegate of France for total time period of 2 minutes, individual speaking time of 1 minute. Are there any votes for this motion? Seeing unanimous votes, this moderated caucus has been passed. Delegate of France, would you like to speak first or last in this moderated caucus?
First, please.
The floor is yours. You have 1 minute.
Thank you. Domestic violence is a prevalent social evil which is universal. France believes that addressing its origins and the signs of domestic violence is a good way to address it within society. France believes in giving a platform to survivors of domestic violence to create awareness within the public about the silent suffering behind closed doors. It is also extremely important to take the first steps towards criminalizing or condemning the act of domestic violence in and of itself. Thank you. I yield my time to the chair.
Thank you, Delegate of France. Just for future notice, you do not have to yield your time in a moderated caucus. Yielding time is only for general speakers list speeches. That being said, are there any other delegates wishing to speak on this moderated caucus? We have 1 slot left for a minute speech. Delegate of Ghana, the floor is yours for a minute.
While the delegate of Ghana appreciates that domestic violence is, of course, a large and prevalent problem, Ghana, like a number of other developing countries, is stretched thin when it comes to funds and resources. While we agree that domestic violence is an evil that stretches all over the world, there are far more pressing issues that we face at this time. As a country, we have to look at rising levels of poverty, illness, and lack of social and economic infrastructure our citizens are currently suffering from. And this is compounded by the rising tide of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ghana must focus its attention onto saving lives and preventing more deaths. While this nation is completely willing to address the problem of domestic violence, it is not willing to address that problem without resources, funding, and significant support from the other members of this chamber. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delegate. This moderated caucus has now lapsed. Are there any other points or motions on the floor at this point of time? Delegate of USA.
The delegate of the United States of America would like to raise a motion for moderated caucus of 2 minutes per speaker time being 1 minute for the topic funding for hotline services for domestic violence victims.
Thank you, Delegate. That is in order. We will now move in, seeing that there are no other motions on the floor, we will now be moving into voting on the moderated caucus topic proposed by the Delegate of the United States. On the topic funding for hotline services for a total time period of 2 minutes, individual speaking time of 1 minute. Are there any votes for this motion? Seeing a unanimous vote, this moderated caucus motion has passed. Delegate of USA, would you like to speak first or last?
First, please.
The floor is yours. You have 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, delegates, for the previous discussion. The delegate of the United States understands both France's and Ghana's point of view. Yes, every country has the right to deal with their problems differently. However, with pooling our resources together, we can make some minimum uniform system to tackle this problem. The United States understands that resources are stretched thin, especially during this pandemic, where the debilitating effects of the pandemic have left countries weakened at their knees. Therefore, the USA believes that a simple structure and a simple solution of creating helplines for victims of domestic violence is a less expensive and yet effective way of addressing at least some part of this issue. These helplines can then either help women escape or inform the law enforcement. This can be a start of an effective system which would not require extensive amount of resources, but it would still create some sort of security for these victims and some type of escape route in this lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Your 1 minute has lapsed. Are there any other speakers wishing to add their names to this moderated caucus? Delegate of France, you've been acknowledged for a minute. The floor is yours.
The delegate of France wholeheartedly agrees with the USA and would like to echo the sentiment. We do believe that more active and 24/7 helpline services should be provided, especially during this time of lockdown, in order for the women trapped inside their house due to curfews and quarantine to get in touch with law enforcement or even just counselling services. It is equally important we pay attention to where these victims can escape to. However, therefore, France would like to further implore this committee to address the possibility of creating shelters for victims of domestic abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. With that, we have come to the end of this moderated caucus. At this point of time, are there any points or motions on the floor? Delegate of Ghana, you've been acknowledged.
Motion for a 3-minute unmoderated caucus to incorporate our solutions into a working paper.
That motion is in order. Seeing that there are no other motions on the floor, we'll move into voting on the motion raised by the Delegate of Ghana for an unmoderated caucus for 3 minutes. Are there any votes for this motion? Any votes against? Seeing no votes against, this motion passes unanimously. You are now in a 3-minute unmoderated caucus to work on your working paper. Go ahead, delegates, you may begin.
Thank you. So the Delegate of the United States would first of all thank both Delegate of Ghana and Delegate of France for putting forward such important points that would lead us to a better solution and better debate further in the committee. Moreover, the United States would like to stand by the solution that they have proposed in the previous moderated caucus, which is to create helplines which run 24/7 for the victims of domestic abuse, just so they could call someone, just so they could, know that someone is there in their corner, or just so they could have someone inform the law enforcement when they're trapped within their own household. the delegate does believe that this is a more cost-efficient way of dealing with the problem, and also it is quite, as you would say, under the radar, so the abuser would not be able to, get to know about it much. However, the delegate does welcome any kind of critique and other solutions that the delegates may have. Thank you.
Does the delegate of Ghana have anything particular to say about resources on this issue, given its relative cost effectiveness?
Well, in the case of a 24/7 helpline, there comes the inevitable question, as the delegate of France has raised, of funding. The delegate of Ghana is, as he has already brought up, there is a great deal of problems that the nation of Ghana is already facing, and it becomes difficult to fund and properly maintain these solutions without significant aid from this chamber. And so the question that this delegate would like to pose is that how willing would the other nations in this chamber be to support Ghana in this endeavor financially?
Given their relative assurances and abilities to ensure that the relative grants and funds for the setting up of these 24/7 domestic abuse hotlines were being used for these 24/7 hotlines, there will be a certain willingness on the part of France to contribute funds towards a pot, shall we say, for various countries to use in order to set up these funds, as long as, I will repeat, they were being used for these purposes and not being used to further any other means or goals.
That is acceptable.
The delegate of US.
Delegate of Ghana, apologies, delegate of USA. That is acceptable to the delegate of Ghana. Please continue, delegate of USA. My apologies.
Yeah, the delegate of USA would just like to chip in with France and say that we are willing to put in some funds through the channel of UN Women itself towards this problem, and therefore we are not pushing nations to deal with this on their own when clearly there is a lack of resources. However, one of the solutions that Delegate of France raised was creating shelters for victims of domestic abuse. A cost-effective way can be just, creating an initiative of families taking in victims of domestic abuse instead of creating shelters in countries that do not have enough resources to open them. This could be a good way. However, the countries that do have resources can open or, maintain their own shelters for the women and children who are suffering from domestic abuse. I think these are all the points that need to be taken into the working paper as of this point, and we can further discuss it in moderated caucus or general speakers list.
Delegates, that's perfect timing because you have 5 seconds left on this unmoderated caucus. If you're done, then we can just call it the end of this unmoderated caucus. Seeing that there are no other motions on the floor at this point of time, we will now be reverting back to the general speakers list. Delegate of Ghana, your name was on the general speakers list, so the floor is yours for a minute.
The delegate of Ghana is very, very pleased to see that their fears have been allayed and their concerns answered in a satisfactory manner. And while the delegate of Ghana will, of course, maintain their initial position that Ghana as a nation has greater worries and more significant worries and places to focus resources and focus funding, the support from the rest of this chamber is encouraging and will allow Ghana to take the next step and implement real, practical, working solutions to combat a problem, nay, a pandemic, to use the words of the delegate of France, that is plaguing this nation. And as a result, the delegate of Ghana comes away particularly satisfied with the outcome of this committee session. Thank you very much. I yield my time to the chair.
Thank you, Delegate. With that, we've come to the end of this session. Well done, delegates.